The rain hammered against the windows of the cramped Manhattan apartment where Samantha Reed sat surrounded by walls covered in photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes connected by red string. At 28 years old, she had built a reputation as the journalist who went where others feared to tread, the one who exposed corruption in City Hall, human trafficking rings operating beneath legitimate businesses, and politicians with blood money in their pockets. But the Valente crime family was different. They were ghosts in expensive suits, whispers, and backrooms, a name that made seasoned detectives look away. For 3 months, she had been collecting fragments of their empire, watching from the shadows, and now she was ready to step into their world. The decision to go undercover came on a frigid February night when her editor dismissed her research as too dangerous, too circumstantial, too likely to get her killed. Samantha left his office and walked through Times Square, the neon lights reflecting off the wet pavement, tourists laughing and taking photographs while somewhere in this same city, the Valentes controlled entire neighborhoods like feudal lords. She thought about her father, a detective who died investigating organized crime when she was 15, about the closed case file that never sat right with her, about the way her mother's hands shook whenever mob violence made the evening news. This story was not just about exposing criminals. It was about proving that the truth could still win, even against people who made the truth disappear. Infiltration. The Crimson Lounge sat on a corner in Little Italy, its exterior unremarkable except for the valet's parking cars that cost more than most people earned in a year. Samantha had spent weeks learning everything about the place, memorizing the staff schedules, the regulars, the way the real business happened in the private rooms upstairs while tourists drank overpriced cocktails below. She fabricated a background, created social media accounts going back years, and befriended a bartender who was leaving for a job in Boston. When she walked in for her interview wearing a black dress and her hair pulled back, the manager looked her over with the practiced assessment of someone who evaluated people for vulnerabilities. She got the job within 20 minutes. The first week was mundane work, learning the drink recipes, memorizing which customers preferred their whiskey neat and which wanted elaborate cocktails. But Samantha watched everything. She noticed which tables the servers avoided unless explicitly told to approach, which men walked past the velvet rope without speaking to security, which conversations stopped when she came within earshot. The tiny recording device hidden in her watch captured fragments of discussions about shipments, payoffs, territory disputes. She photographed faces with her phone during bathroom breaks, matching them later to police databases and newspaper archives. The Valente organization was larger than anyone suspected, with connections reaching into construction companies, waste management, labor unions, and the ports where cargo containers arrived from overseas without proper inspections. Enzo Valente first appeared on a Thursday night in early March when winter was beginning to loosen its grip on the city. Samantha was wiping down the bar when the room's energy shifted, conversations becoming quieter, postures straightening. He entered through a private entrance, surrounded by 3 men in dark suits, and the crowd parted naturally as if choreographed. He was younger than she expected, perhaps 35, with dark hair, sharp cheekbones, and eyes that seemed to calculate trajectories and consequences in the space of a glance. While his associates settled into a corner booth, he approached the bar and ordered an old-fashioned with specific instructions about the type of bitters and the orange peel. His voice was measured, educated, nothing like the stereotypical gangster from movies. When Samantha served the drink, their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and she felt the weight of being truly seen for the first time since entering this world. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged. Enzo came to the Crimson Lounge twice a week, always accompanied but always eventually finding his way to the bar where Samantha worked. Their interactions were brief, professional, but she sensed him studying her with an intensity that made her check her fabricated background for holes. She learned from overheard conversations that he was the strategist of the family, the one who transformed his father's brutal street operation into a sophisticated criminal enterprise that politicians and businessmen courted. He read voraciously, collected art, donated to children's hospitals under shell corporations. The contradiction unsettled her, the way someone so clearly intelligent had chosen this path, the way violence and culture coexisted in the same person. Discovery. The night everything changed began like any other. Spring had arrived in New York, bringing warmer air and the smell of street food from the vendors outside. Samantha was preparing to end her shift when Enzo arrived earlier than usual. alone, his normally composed expression showing cracks of exhaustion. He sat at the bar rather than his usual booth and ordered a drink without his customary specific instructions. For 20 minutes they existed in silence broken only by the ambient music and distant laughter. Then he spoke, his voice low enough that only she could hear, and asked how long she had been recording him. The blood drained from Samantha's face. Her hand instinctively went to her watch, a gesture that confirmed everything. Enzo's expression did not change. No anger or threat, just a profound weariness. He explained that he had known from her third day working there, that the background she created was good but not perfect, that someone in his position survived by noticing the small inconsistencies that everyone else missed. He had watched her watching him, seen the way she positioned herself to overhear conversations, noticed how her breaks coincided with certain arrivals. For a moment, Samantha thought about running, but his security would catch her before she reached the door, and besides, a strange calm had settled over her, the relief of masks finally dropping. Instead of threatening her, Enzo made an unexpected offer. If she wanted the truth about the Valente family, he would show it to her, all of it, the good and the terrible, the reasons and the costs. But she would have to see it with her own eyes, not through the distorted lens of surveillance and stolen recordings. She would have to understand the full context before writing her story. The proposal was so unusual, so contrary to every crime drama she had ever watched, that Samantha found herself agreeing before fully processing the implications. They left the Crimson Lounge together, walking past his security detail into the New York night, and her investigation transformed into something far more complicated than she had anticipated. The next 3 months became a descent into a world that operated by rules most citizens never saw. Enzo kept his word, showing her everything. She witnessed collections from businesses paying protection money, but also saw how that money funded neighborhood programs the city had abandoned, how elderly residents received groceries and repairs they could not afford otherwise. She observed meetings where violence was discussed with cold calculation, but also heard the reasoning behind territorial boundaries that prevented wider conflicts. She was there when a young man who had stolen from the family was beaten until he could barely stand, but she also learned he had been given 3 warnings and chances to make restitution, that the alternative to this punishment was worse. Enzo never tried to justify the criminal enterprise or pretend it was something noble. Instead, he showed her the machinery of it, how poverty and lack of opportunity created soldiers, how legitimate businesses would not hire men with records, how the system pushed people into the margins and then punished them for surviving there. He took her to his childhood neighborhood in Brooklyn, showed her the building where he grew up, the corner where his older brother was shot by a rival gang when Enzo was 12. He explained how his father rose to power through brutality, but also through providing what the community needed when everyone else had written them off. The Valente family was not born from evil, but from absence, from the vacuum left when institutions failed. As spring turned to early summer, Samantha found herself in territory far more dangerous than criminal investigation. She was beginning to understand Enzo not as a subject but as a person, seeing the weight he carried, the impossible choices between loyalty and morality, the exhaustion of maintaining an empire built on violence while trying to transform it into something sustainable. She watched him play chess with elderly men in neighborhood parks, saw him reading philosophy in quiet moments, noticed how he ensured families of imprisoned associates received support. The cognitive dissonance was crushing, knowing he had ordered people hurt or killed while also seeing genuine care for his community, recognizing intelligence and strategy while witnessing ruthless pragmatism, betrayal and choice. The crisis came in late June when temperatures soared and the city felt like it was melting into its own pavement. Samantha had been documenting everything in encrypted files, writing the most comprehensive examination of organized crime anyone had ever attempted, trying to capture the nuance and complexity she had discovered. She had told Enzo she would not publish anything until she had seen the full picture, that she would give him the chance to respond before the story ran. But someone at her newspaper, growing impatient with her prolonged absence and mysterious research, accessed her cloud storage through a shared server. By the time Samantha realized what had happened, excerpts of her unfinished investigation were already being prepared for publication, stripped of context, reduced to sensational headlines about a journalist embedded with the mob. The leak put multiple people in danger immediately. Sources Samantha had promised anonymity were now exposed. Businesses that had cooperated unwittingly were identified. And most critically, Rivals of the Valente family saw an opportunity to strike, while they appeared vulnerable. Samantha's editor called, demanding she come in and finish the story before competitors stole the scoop. Unable to understand why she was not celebrating this exposure, she stood in her apartment looking at the wall of evidence she had collected, realizing with horror that her pursuit of truth was about to get people killed, that the complexity she had tried so hard to capture was being flattened into good versus evil, heroes versus villains. When Enzo found out, his controlled facade finally shattered, not with rage directed at her, but with the terrible calm of someone calculating losses. He explained what would happen now, how the leaked information would trigger conflicts that had been carefully managed, how rival families would see this as the Valentes cooperating with law enforcement, how federal prosecutors would use anything they could from her notes to build cases. The empire he had been trying to slowly legitimize, moving money into legal businesses and reducing violence, was going to collapse into exactly the bloodshed he had worked years to prevent. And Samantha, the reporter who had wanted only to expose corruption and criminality, had become the catalyst for chaos. The first attack came 3 days later, a shooting outside a Valente-controlled restaurant that left 2 men dead and a waitress critically injured. The second was a firebombing of a social club in Queens. Federal agents began making arrests based on information from the leaked documents, taking low-level associates off the street and creating power vacuums that more violent criminals rushed to fill. Samantha watched it unfold through news reports and calls from Enzo, who was managing crisis after crisis, trying to prevent total war while also protecting people who depended on the family's structure. She had not slept in days, the weight of unintended consequences crushing her, the realization that investigative journalism and moral certainty meant nothing against the messy reality of human systems. The decision to complete and publish the full story, with all its complexity and nuance, came from a conversation with her mother. Sitting in the small apartment where she had grown up, Samantha confessed everything: the infiltration, the relationship with Enzo, the catastrophic leak. Her mother listened without interruption, then spoke about Samantha's father, about how he had believed the truth mattered but also understood that truth without wisdom was just another weapon. The story needed to be told, but it needed to be told right, showing not just what the Valentes did but why the system that created them remained unchanged, why communities turned to organized crime when legitimate institutions abandoned them. It would not absolve anyone, but it might prevent the reduction of complex human beings into simple narratives of good and evil. Reckoning Samantha worked for 72 hours straight, barely eating or sleeping, crafting the most important piece of journalism she would ever write. She detailed the Valente family's criminal activities without flinching from their reality, but she also exposed the systemic failures that made such organizations inevitable, the police corruption that allowed them to flourish, the political indifference to struggling neighborhoods, the economic policies that created permanent underclasses. She wrote about Enzo not as a villain or a misunderstood hero, but as a human being, making choices within impossible circumstances, someone who had inherited violence and was trying to transform it while being trapped by its momentum. The piece was 20,000 words, far longer than any newspaper article, but her editor agreed to run it as a special series after reading the first draft. The morning the story was set to publish, Samantha received a call from an unknown number. Enzo's voice was tight with controlled emotion, telling her that federal agents were preparing to arrest him based on the leaked documents, that the carefully constructed legal barriers between him and criminal activities were collapsing. He was calling not to threaten or plead, but to tell her that he understood why she did it, that pursuing truth was its own kind of loyalty, and that he hoped her story captured something real. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, but in the silence after he hung up, Samantha understood that some connections transcended the categories society built to make sense of the world, that knowing someone deeply made judgment both necessary and impossible. The arrest happened at the Crimson Lounge, deliberately theatrical staging by federal prosecutors who wanted maximum publicity. Samantha was there, no longer undercover, her press credentials clearly visible, watching as Enzo was led out in handcuffs while cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. The scene was carefully choreographed chaos, agents making sure every news outlet got the footage, politicians already preparing statements about being tough on organized crime. But Samantha saw what the cameras missed, the way Enzo moved through it with dignity despite the humiliation, the glance he gave his attorney that communicated volumes of instructions, The moment his eyes found hers in the crowd with an expression that was not anger, but something more like recognition. The story published the next morning across 8 full pages of the newspaper, and as an interactive feature online. Response was immediate and polarized. Law enforcement officials praised the exposure of criminal activities while criticizing her methodology and the time spent embedded. Criminal justice reform advocates highlighted her documentation of systemic failures. Some journalists called it the best investigative work in a generation, while others condemned her relationship with her subject as a fundamental ethical violation. Samantha read every response, every angry email and thoughtful analysis, understanding that she had sacrificed simple heroism for complicated truth, that she would never again be the crusading reporter with uncomplicated moral authority. Aftermath. The trial took 9 months, dominating New York media as prosecutors presented their case built on years of investigation, supplemented by details from Samantha's leaked documents. She was called to testify, her credibility attacked by defense attorneys who painted her as unreliable, her methods questioned by prosecutors who wanted her information, but not her nuance. On the witness stand, she answered every question with the same careful honesty that had characterized her final story, refusing to simplify what she had seen, acknowledging both criminal activity and the context that surrounded it. The jury listened with expressions ranging from fascination to confusion, clearly struggling with testimony that did not fit neat narratives of good and evil. Enzo was convicted on multiple charges including racketeering, money laundering, and conspiracy. The sentence was 15 years in federal prison, less than prosecutors wanted but more than the defense hoped. Throughout the trial, he maintained the same composed dignity, never appearing to threaten anyone, speaking eloquently during sentencing about accepting responsibility, while also noting the systems that remained unchanged. Samantha was in the courtroom when the verdict was read, watching as he was led away, noticing the subtle nod he gave her that could have meant forgiveness, or simply acknowledgement that they had both followed their paths to their logical conclusions. The Valente crime family fragmented in the power vacuum, some factions attempting to maintain the organization, while others splintered into more violent operations. The social programs Enzo had built began to collapse without funding, and within months, the neighborhoods that had relied on them showed increasing signs of strain. Samantha documented this too, following up her initial story with reporting on what happened when criminal organizations were dismantled without addressing the conditions that created them. The work was less celebrated, making readers uncomfortable by suggesting that simple enforcement was not simple solutions, that destroying bad systems without building good ones just created different problems. She visited Enzo once, 6 months into his sentence, driving to the federal facility in upstate New York through autumn leaves and diminishing daylight. They sat across from each other, separated by scratched plexiglass, picking up phones to communicate, the absurdity of the barrier after everything they had shared, making them both almost smile. The conversation was careful, monitored, but they managed to communicate what mattered. He told her the story was the right one, complex and honest, that more people needed to see how things actually worked rather than how they appeared. She told him she was working on a book, expanding everything she had learned, trying to contribute something meaningful to conversations about crime and justice and community. They talked for 30 minutes about everything and nothing, about books he was reading and stories she was reporting, two people whose lives had intersected at strange angles and left permanent marks. Conclusion. 2 years later, Samantha stood in a bookstore in Greenwich Village for the launch of her book about organized crime, systemic failure, and the gray areas where morality became complicated. The audience was diverse: former prosecutors and defense attorneys, academics and activists, people from the neighborhoods she had written about. During the question and answer session, someone asked if she regretted the investigation, if knowing the consequences would have changed her approach. She considered the question carefully, thinking about everything that had happened, about lives disrupted and truths revealed, about the people helped and people hurt by her pursuit of this story. Her answer was that journalism was about bearing witness to complexity rather than imposing simple conclusions, about showing people the full picture and trusting them to wrestle with difficult questions. She did not regret pursuing the truth about the Valente family, but she had learned that truth existed in relationship to context, that understanding was different from absolving, that the best stories left readers troubled rather than satisfied. She thought about Enzo in prison, about the neighborhood still struggling, about the systems that remained fundamentally unchanged despite all her reporting. The work was not about having answers, but about asking better questions, about refusing to accept easy narratives that let society ignore its own complicity in creating the problems it then punished. The book became a bestseller and won several awards for investigative journalism. Samantha was offered positions at major publications, but chose to remain freelance, focusing on long-form stories about criminal justice, poverty, and institutional failure. She continued visiting Enzo occasionally, their conversations evolving from the specifics of his case to broader discussions about change and redemption and whether systems designed to punish could ever actually heal. Their relationship defied categorization, neither friendship nor romance, but something shaped by the unique circumstances that had brought them together. Two people on opposite sides of societal lines who had seen each other with unusual clarity. On a cold November evening 3 years after the initial story published, Samantha walked through Little Italy past the Crimson Lounge, which had new ownership and a different name. The neighborhood looked the same, but felt different. The subtle presence of organized crime influence replaced by other forms of power and control. The problems renamed rather than solved. She thought about her father, about whether he would approve of the work she had done, the choices she had made. She liked to believe he would understand that the most important stories were the ones that complicated rather than confirmed what people already believed. That bearing witness to messy reality was its own kind of courage. The recording device she had worn that first night as a bartender sat in a drawer in her apartment, a reminder of how much had changed since she walked into that world with certainty about truth and justice. She had learned that the most important story was not about good people versus bad people, but about how systems shaped individuals, how context influenced choice, how understanding required holding contradictions without collapsing into relativism. The Valente story was not finished, probably would never be finished, because the conditions that created it continued, the cycle repeating with different names and different faces, but the same underlying failure of society to care for all its members. Years later, when Enzo was eventually released on parole, having served his time and aged in the way prison aged people prematurely, Samantha was waiting outside the facility. They did not embrace or speak immediately, just stood in the parking lot as winter wind cut through their coats. Two people whose lives had been fundamentally altered by truth and consequence. They would never return to who they were before their paths crossed, could never undo the choices that had led them here. But they had both emerged with something more valuable than innocence, a hard-won understanding of how the world actually worked beneath its comfortable illusions. The story of Samantha Reed and Enzo Valente was not a romance or a tragedy, but something more subtle and enduring, a narrative about the cost of truth and the weight of knowledge, about what happened when someone looked beyond surfaces and found not answers, but better questions. It was a story that continued in the work Samantha did. The changes Enzo attempted to make with his second chance, the readers who encountered their tale and carried it forward into their own understanding of justice and mercy, and the complicated reality of human beings trying to survive in broken systems. If you found this story compelling, subscribe to our channel for more narratives that explore the gray areas of morality, truth, and the complex human experiences that shape our world. Each story here challenges simple conclusions and invites you to think deeply about the systems we live within and the choices we make within them. 5 years after Enzo Valente walked out of federal prison, Samantha Reed sat in a coffee shop in Brooklyn, the same neighborhood where he had grown up, watching the street through rain-streaked windows. The area had changed dramatically, gentrification transforming corner stores into artisan bakeries, old apartment buildings converted into expensive lofts. The families who had lived here for generations were being pushed out by rising rents, replaced by young professionals who saw the neighborhood as charming rather than home. It was a different kind of displacement, legal and celebrated, but displacement nonetheless. Enzo had requested this meeting, his first direct contact in over a year. After his release, he had deliberately distanced himself from everyone connected to his former life, understanding that parole meant constant surveillance, that federal agents watched for any sign he was returning to criminal activity. He had taken a job at a nonprofit that helped formerly incarcerated people find employment and housing, work that paid barely enough to live on, but gave him purpose beyond the empire he had once controlled. Samantha had followed his progress from a distance, respecting his need for space while occasionally checking in through mutual contacts. When he entered the coffee shop, she almost did not recognize him. Prison and the years after had carved new lines into his face, gray threading through his dark hair, his expensive suits replaced by jeans and a simple jacket. But his eyes held the same sharp intelligence, the same capacity for seeing patterns and connections that had made him dangerous in one life and valuable in another. He ordered black coffee and sat across from her, and for a moment neither spoke, the weight of shared history filling the silence between them. Enzo began talking about the work he was doing, about men released from prison with no support systems, no marketable skills beyond what they had learned in criminal enterprises. He described the frustration of watching the same cycles repeat, guys trying to go straight but hitting walls at every turn, employers who would not hire them, landlords who rejected their applications, the grinding poverty that made illegal income look rational rather than immoral. The non-profit helped where it could, but resources were limited, and the systemic problems were vast. He spoke with the same strategic mind that had once run a criminal organization, but now applied to breaking rather than exploiting those systems. Samantha told him about her recent work, a multi-year investigation into the prison industrial complex and its economic incentives for incarceration. The research had taken her into private prisons, courtrooms where poor defendants received inadequate representation, communities where policing focused on revenue generation rather than public safety. She had interviewed hundreds of people, from judges to former inmates to families torn apart by the system, building a comprehensive picture of how America had turned punishment into profit. The book was nearly finished, and she believed it was the most important work she had done, even more significant than the Valente story that had launched her career. They talked for over 2 hours, their conversation flowing with the ease of people who had seen each other at their worst and most vulnerable, who had no illusions left to protect. Enzo admitted that he still carried guilt about the harm his organization had caused, that no amount of good work now could erase the violence he had authorized, the lives damaged by drugs his family had distributed, the fear they had cultivated to maintain power. Prison had given him time to think beyond justifications and rationalizations, to face the full weight of his choices without the armor of strategic necessity. Redemption was not something he expected or even believed in, but making different choices going forward was the only option that made sense. Samantha confessed her own ongoing struggles with the consequences of her investigation, how the leaked documents had contributed to violence she had not intended, how her pursuit of truth had been both necessary and destructive. She thought often about the waitress injured in the shooting that followed her story's exposure, about families disrupted by arrests, about the ways her work had been used by prosecutors to build cases that fed into the same prison system she now criticized. Journalism was supposed to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted, but reality was messier, truth more complicated than those clean moral categories suggested. The conversation eventually turned to the question that had haunted both of them since their paths first crossed: whether change was actually possible, whether individuals could transform themselves, and whether systems could be reformed or needed to be completely reimagined. Enzo had seen both sides, the criminal world and the legitimate one, and found hypocrisy and exploitation in both, different forms of power operating by different rules but serving similar functions of control. Samantha had documented enough institutional failure to understand why people lost faith in legal systems, why communities created their own structures of order when official ones abandoned them. As the afternoon light faded and the coffee shop began preparing to close, Enzo mentioned something he had been considering, a project that would combine Samantha's platform and his insider knowledge. He wanted to create a documentary series that followed formerly incarcerated people trying to rebuild their lives, showing not the dramatic prison release, but the grinding daily reality of navigating a world designed to keep them marginalized. It would require Samantha's storytelling skills and his community connections, a collaboration that would certainly draw scrutiny from law enforcement and criticism from people who believed he should remain silent and invisible after his crimes. The idea appealed to Samantha immediately, recognizing it as a natural extension of the work they had both been doing separately. But she also understood the complications, how their collaboration would be perceived, the questions about objectivity and ethics that would inevitably arise. Her career had survived the controversy of the original Valente story, but working directly with him on a new project would test those boundaries again. She told him she needed time to consider it, to consult with colleagues and think through the implications, but that the concept was exactly the kind of story that needed telling. Before they parted, Enzo pulled out a worn paperback, a collection of essays about justice and mercy that Samantha had recommended during one of her prison visits years earlier. He had read it dozens of times, he said, finding new meaning with each reading, the ideas evolving as his own understanding deepened. He wanted her to have it back, inscribed with notes in the margins, his dialogue with the text and with his own conscience. Samantha accepted the book, recognizing the gesture as something significant, a passing of knowledge transformed by experience. Walking back to her apartment through Brooklyn streets now glowing with evening lights, Samantha thought about trajectories and consequences, about how a single decision to infiltrate the Crimson Lounge had set in motion changes neither she nor Enzo could have predicted. Their story was not about redemption in any conventional sense, not about criminals reformed or journalists vindicated, but about the harder truth that understanding complicated people without excusing harmful actions was possible, that change was real even when it could not undo the past. The documentary project, if it happened, would be controversial and difficult, requiring navigation of legal restrictions, ethical considerations, and public skepticism. But it would also be true in the way that mattered most to Samantha, showing the full complexity of human beings trapped in systems that reduced them to categories and statistics. It would honor what she had learned from Enzo and from everyone whose lives intersected with the criminal justice system, that the most important stories were the ones that refused simple conclusions, that demanded audiences sit with discomfort and uncertainty, that insisted on seeing complete humanity in people society preferred to forget. Years later, when the documentary series premiered and sparked national conversations about incarceration and re-entry, critics would debate whether Samantha had crossed ethical lines by working with a former crime boss, whether Enzo deserved a platform after his crimes, whether the stories they told served justice or undermined it. But the people who appeared in the series, men and women trying to rebuild lives in a system designed to keep them failing, would say it was the first time anyone had shown their reality without judgment or pity, with just clear-eyed documentation of structural barriers and individual perseverance. The final episode ended with Enzo speaking directly to the camera about accountability and change, about living with the weight of past actions while building something different going forward. It was not inspirational or redemptive, just honest. The kind of honesty that Samantha had pursued since the beginning. The recognition that human beings contained multitudes of contradiction. That understanding was more valuable than judgment. That the work of building better systems required seeing clearly what currently existed. The story that began in the Crimson Lounge continued, transformed but not finished, a testament to the complicated truth that some connections, forged in unusual circumstances, carried obligations that transcended conventional categories of right and wrong.